It was a gloomy Monday morning at the University of Michigan. Cold white lights lit up the massive lecture hall for advanced mathematics. Over 100 students had taken their seats, flipping open notebooks, booting up laptops, preparing themselves for one of the most dreaded classes on campus. Professor Evelyn Harrow's complex calculus. The air stiffened as sharp footsteps echoed from the hallway. Harrow entered, tall and slender, with silver hair neatly pinned up and wearing cold-rimmed silver glasses. Every step she took proclaimed that this was her domain and that failure was part of the curriculum. But among the sea of white students from affluent families sat one figure who stood out, a slim, dark-skinned boy in a faded hoodie and worn jeans. Kofi Ellis. He sat silently in the middle row, head lowered, flipping through a notebook filled with dense formulas written in handwriting, so round and precise it seemed unreal. No one said a word, but his presence drew glances, some curious, others skeptical, even disdainful. In the front row, a group of visiting professors, well-known figures in the academic world, watched the class with a detached, critical eye. One man with salt and pepper hair, Professor Whitmore from Princeton, furrowed his brows at the sight of Kofi. He leaned toward the colleague next to him and muttered, "He got into Harrow's class. Must be a diversity slot." The other smirked faintly. "Don't worry. This class weed him out soon enough." They didn't have to speak loudly. Kofi had heard it all before. He'd heard it his whole life. Harrow opened her textbook at the podium, lifted her gaze, and scanned the room. Her eyes paused briefly on Kofi. It wasn't a long, deep look, but it was enough. He felt it all. Doubt, judgment, and dismissal. Kofi took a deep breath. He wasn't here to please anyone. He was here for himself, and for the numbers that always told the truth. And now, the silent battle had begun. The sharp screech of chalk echoed through the vast lecture hall. Professor Evelyn Harrow wrote each formula with firm, precise strokes, each mark of chalk carrying the same iron-willed message she lived by. If you can't keep up, leave. Last week we covered multivariable limits. Today we move on to the Laplace transform. And if you didn't understand the previous material, my condolences. The class chuckled, but soon eyes began shifting toward one spot, Kofi Ellis. Still silent, he stared at the board, idly twirling a pen in his palm. He wasn't taking notes. Into the front row, a female guest professor from Yale whispered with a smirk, "He's not writing anything. Uninterested or just not following?" Whitmore curled his lip. "Maybe both." Harrow heard them. She didn't respond aloud, but glanced at Kofi again. Her eyes were cold as steel. "Some people believe all students have potential," she said. "I believe potential belongs only to those who dare push the boundaries of their limits." Her gaze landed squarely on Kofi as she delivered the final line, like a blade drawn with precision, without ever naming its target. Kofi felt the weight of every stare, doubtful, condescending, waiting for him to fail. But he didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, back in high school when a teacher once told him to his face, "Math isn't made for kids like you." He remembered. He had etched it into his mind, and under dim streetlights, night after night, he had proven the opposite to himself. No need to argue, no need to fight back. Just wait for mathematics to speak. He sat still, composed, in the middle of a storm of prejudice, his gaze unshaken, without fear, without resentment. Only one thing shone through, an unwavering resolve. A long equation stretched across the blackboard as Professor Harrow wrote sharply. Laplace transform symbols filled the space, each stroke of chalk a declaration of her absolute authority in the room. "This forms the basis for understanding more complex differential systems," she said flatly, eyes fixed on the board. "If you fall behind, you'll find yourself left behind." She didn't look at the students. She spoke as if to the air, but everyone knew who she meant. Kofi Ellis sat quietly in the middle row, his eyes tracing the lines of formulas. Then he frowned. It's a small mistake, a misapplication of the initial condition in the third step. It is easily overlooked, but the entire system would yield an incorrect result if followed. He glanced around. No one else seemed to notice. Students were copying notes mechanically, as if the writing on the board were an untouchable truth. Kofi took a deep breath. He knew that raising his hand would draw every eye in the room, and none of them kindly. But staying silent would mean betraying the very thing he believed in. Accuracy is the voice of intellect, regardless of who speaks. He raised his hand. The air froze instantly. Professor Harrow turned slowly, her gaze cold and cutting like a blade. Is there a problem, Ellis? Kofi rose slowly. His voice was steady. Professor, there's a sign error in step 3. If we continue from there, the final solution will be entirely off. A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Several guest professors raised their eyebrows. Harrow narrowed her eyes, her lips curling, not in a smile, but a challenge. She turned back to the board, examined the equation, and paused. Then, without a word, she held out the chalk to Kofi. If you're so sure, go up and fix it. The room went silent. A trap. An open challenge. Student versus professor. And Harrow knew. If Kofi were wrong, he'd become a laughingstock, crucified by his courage. Kofi said nothing. He walked to the board, took the chalk, erased the error, and rewrote the equation. Each symbol precise, measured, razor-sharp. The tension in the room was taut as a wire. A guest professor straightened in his chair. A student in the back whispered, "He's right." As Kofi stepped away from the board, Harrow said nothing. She stared at the corrected formula, face unreadable, but the chalk in her hand was now gripped tighter than before. No praise, no nod, but in the eyes of some students, for the very first time, something had shifted. Respect. Kofi walked back to his seat, the eyes of dozens trailing behind him like cold needles. But he didn't flinch. He was used to this, to the skeptical stares, the silent judgment. Professor Harrow stood motionless in front of the board for a moment. She turned the chalk lightly in her fingers, then resumed the lecture as if nothing had happened. No acknowledgement, no thank you. But no one in the room could ignore the truth. A black student had just corrected a mistake by one of the university's most respected math professors. As Harrow returned to face the class, her eyes crossed the room as usual, but this time, they lingered just a second longer on Kofi's face, not with the disdain they once held, but with the look of someone who had just been challenged and knew she had let something slip. Something in the room had shifted. A girl sitting near Kofi glanced over, not with contempt, but with something closer to curiosity. In the upper row, a student who had smirked when Kofi raised his hand was now silently scratching a mistaken note in his notebook. A guest professor leaned slightly and murmured to the colleague beside him, "That kid, he's got real talent." Kofi didn't react to the whispers or the stares. He kept taking notes, calm and focused, as if nothing had happened and it wasn't worth celebrating. But deep within him, a quiet feeling began to spread. Not pride, but affirmation. He belonged here. And Harrow? She continued lecturing, her voice as stern and methodical as ever. But in her eyes, buried deep, was something new. Caution. She had lost control of the room for the first time in years of teaching, and it was to a student she had never believed in. The undercurrent had begun, silent, irreversible, and growing stronger. The lecture seemed to have returned to its normal rhythm, but the storm had just begun inside Professor Harrow. She watched Kofi through her silver-rimmed glasses. He had shown no sign of arrogance after correcting her mistake. He hadn't even looked back. That only made it worse. No boasting, No defiance, just quiet correctness, and that composure carried an unspoken message. I don't need to prove anything. I know I'm right. Harrow couldn't allow that to continue, not in front of visiting scholars. She had not built on iron discipline in the classroom for over 2 decades. She set the chalk down, stepped to the bookshelf beside the podium, and pulled out a thick black volume, Advanced Mathematical Transforms. We'll shift plans a bit, Harrow said, calm but sharp as steel. I want to challenge the class with a special graduate-level problem. A wave of murmurs rippled across the lecture hall. Some students frowned. One visiting professor leaned forward, eyes lighting up with intrigue. At the board, Harrow began to write rapidly. A nonlinear differential equation system coupled with an inverted Fourier transform. A problem so dense it would take most senior students hours to grasp. When she finished, the chalk in her hand snapped in two. A silent signal of tension, barely held in check. Then, Harrow turned, eyes fixed straight at Kofi. Mr. Ellis, since you're so confident, why don't you come solve this? No one breathed. All eyes turned to Kofi, the student once deemed an outsider, now called to face a problem few dared to try. Kofi rose. No hesitation, no questions. He walked to the board, picked up the remaining piece of chalk, and faced a wall of symbols that looked like a mathematical labyrinth. Professor Harrow folded her arms, eyes like blades. This was no longer a test of knowledge, but a battle for authority. Kofi stared at the board for a moment. His gaze was not tense, just focused. Then he began to write. Each stroke was fluid. No stalling, no wandering. A student whispered, "He's not even pausing to think." A visiting professor murmured, "Is he working from intuition? Or has he seen this before?" But no, this was a problem Harrow had written herself. It existed in no textbook, and still, Kofi continued. His equations unfolded with precise structure, seamlessly transitioning from combinatorics to calculus, from theory to application. The chalk lines grew thicker, more intricate, but the more you looked, the more it all made sense. Exact, elegant, beautiful, as if composed like a piece of music. The hall remained silent when he finished the final line and set the chalk down. No one dared to speak, but everyone saw it. Not a single mistake. Harrow stared at the board, her eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in something more vulnerable. Surprise. Maybe even doubt. A guest professor muttered under his breath, "That solution is cleaner than the one I teach grad students." Harrow said nothing, but a small, barely visible hairline crack had appeared in the cold wall of confidence she'd built over the years. Kofi returned to his seat. No smile, no glance. He sat down and resumed taking notes, and everyone who had once mocked him. Now, I watched in silence, as scattered claps ripple through the lecture hall, not in unison, but just enough to shift the atmosphere. Kofi kept his head down, still taking notes. He wasn't used to attention. He didn't trust the kind of praise that changed too quickly. Because Kofi knew that no applause today could erase the nights he studied under streetlights. Flashback 7 years ago. Southfield, Michigan. Winter. The air was freezing. The lights in Kofi's old apartment with his mother were often shut off. They couldn't afford the electricity bill. 14-year-old Kofi, a thin scarf wrapped around his neck, sat beneath the dim yellow glow of a public street lamp at the corner. On his knees, a worn-out copy of Algebra for Beginners. His gloved hands, fingers exposed through holes, shivered from the cold. Next to him sat a lunchbox of cold food, untouched. People walked by, looked, and then moved on. No one asked. No one offered help. But Kofi didn't notice. He was deep into the chapter on quadratic equations. His eyes lit up when he grasped the geometric representation of a negative root. Not because someone had explained it, but because he had figured it out through nothing but raw curiosity. Flashback high school, 11th grade math class. The teacher, a white man named Mr. Borson, stood at the board with folded arms. Kofi, if you don't stop interrupting and asking things beyond the curriculum, I'll have to remove you from the advanced group. But sir, the solution doesn't feel intuitive enough. Math isn't for people who question everything. Maybe you should focus on something more practical, like sports. The class erupted in laughter. Kofi bowed his head. His fingers clenched his notebook filled with self-written proofs in pencil, proofs no one would read, no one would check. Back to present, University of Michigan. The image of Kofi standing silently before a stunned classroom was just a snapshot of a long, lonely journey. He had been doubted, belittled, and excluded from research groups for being unfit for the genius mold. But Kofi never stopped. He studied in the dark to solve problems under the brightest lights. In the faculty row, a visiting professor, Professor Allen from Princeton, whispered to the person beside him. I remember reading a rejected scholarship essay. Kofi Ellis. He wrote about studying under a street lamp. I thought he made it up, but now. He didn't finish the sentence. His eyes were fixed on Kofi, no longer a forgotten file, but a living phenomenon. At the front desk, Professor Harrow glanced down at Kofi's file. Bold print. No scholarship self-funded, no sponsors, no mentors, just willpower and a pencil. Outside the lecture hall, the October wind rustled through falling yellow leaves. But inside, something far more profound had shifted. Not just because of a solved equation, but because a black boy who once studied under a streetlight had forced an entire system to see itself more clearly. Back in the present, the classroom was still frozen in silence. The air felt tightly wrapped in a layer of challenged certainty. Professor Harrow stood with arms crossed, her eyes locked on Kofi, the same student she had dismissed as not worth noticing just an hour earlier. But she wasn't one to surrender easily. Ellis, she said, her voice unusually calm. If the problems in this class no longer challenge you, I have a real opportunity. She placed a small whiteboard on the lectern. Then she turned and pulled out a printed sheet bearing the official seal of the United States National Math Championship. The final question from last year's national championship, doctoral level, 90 minutes. Solve it. And you don't just prove you're right. You prove you're undeniable. The class held its breath. A student whispered, "That's the one that made even MIT finalists drop out." Another muttered, "She's trying to break him," right in front of everyone. But Kofi didn't flinch. He nodded gently. "I'll do it." No arrogance, no defiance. It was just a simple affirmation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. 1 week later. University of Pennsylvania auditorium. Bright lights poured over a packed hall filled with contestants from MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Caltech. The atmosphere was taut, wound tight like a wire. Judges, including Professor Evelyn Harrow and several of the nation's top mathematicians, sat in front. None of them hid their skepticism. A contestant leaned in and whispered, "Who's Kofi Ellis? Never seen him in any previous circuit." A Princeton professor frowned. "A sophomore from Michigan? No coach, no scholarship? What does he think this is? Some open mic night?" Kofi sat alone in the corner. No team, no advisors, just a stack of blank paper, a pen, and his mind. The countdown began. The question appeared on the screen. A nonlinear high-order differential equation integrated with an inverse Fourier transform, never fully solved under time constraints. The room fell silent. Kofi scanned the question. His heart raced, but his eyes stayed calm. Then he began to write. No hesitation, no erasures. There are no wandering lines. The judges leaned in. A professor from Stanford whispered, "Impossible. He's reducing expressions we usually spend hours simplifying." From the back, Harrow narrowed her eyes. Still cold, still composed. But something had shifted. Was it confusion or concern? 45 minutes in. Most contestants were still tangled in the maze of symbols. Only one person stood up to submit. Not MIT, not a Stanford PhD, Kofi. He walked to the front, handed in his work, nodded to the judges, and calmly returned to his seat. The judges flipped through the pages, paused, leaned closer. Another joined, then another. Finally, they exchanged glances. The doubt was gone. Kofi Ellis. The black boy was once dismissed for not looking the part. The kid who studied math beneath a street lamp. The student was cut from advanced programs for not fitting the genius mold. They had just solved a problem even master mathematicians feared. The atmosphere inside the University of Pennsylvania's auditorium felt like the oxygen had been sucked out. The contestants were still hunched over their desks, brows furrowed, papers filled with crossed-out lines. Sweat dripped onto the pages like drops of time, falling under the weight of pressure. But Kofi had already turned in his paper, and his solution was rendering the panel of judges breathlessly silent. A professor from Caltech leaned in close to the page, eyes glued to every line. He didn't speak, just pushed his glasses up to his forehead, then back down again, as if unable to believe what he was reading. Accurate, every single step, he murmured. He even simplified the equations using a pathway that no one's ever thought of before. A judge from MIT leaned over and said, "This isn't memorization. This is pure originality." The exam session ended. The last contestant dropped their pen. All eyes turned toward the judges' table, where Kofi's paper had already been thoroughly reviewed. One of the judges stepped onto the stage. The solution to the final problem has been cross-verified by 3 experts from different universities. He looked toward Kofi, his eyes no longer filled with doubt, but with genuine respect. And the only person to solve it entirely correctly, with an approach both efficient and more innovative than what we expect even at the doctoral level. He paused momentarily, as if to let the entire hall breathe in unison. Is Kofi Ellis, University of Michigan. The auditorium erupted, not with hollow applause, but with stunned, explosive ovation. A group of Harvard students stood up, clapping like they were cheering on an Olympic champion. A professor from Princeton nodded repeatedly, turning to Harrow. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of judging." Professor Evelyn Harrow said nothing. She looked down at where Kofi stood amid the thunderous applause. No arrogance, no raised chin, just the quiet presence of someone who had done the impossible. Her gaze faltered slightly. Inside her, something cracked, a wall that had once stood unshakable. It wasn't just admiration. It was self-doubt. The next day. Front page of the Chronicle of Higher Education. Black boy from a poor neighborhood defeats nation's top math geniuses. The media buzzed with coverage. TV interviews rolled out. A hashtag spread across social media. #Kofi Unstoppable. But inside a small dorm room, Kofi quietly opened his old laptop, reading the flood of messages and emails sent from across the country. "I'm an 11th grader. I used to think math wasn't for me because I'm black. Thank you for giving me a reason to dream." Malik J., Bronx, New York. My son watched you compete and said, "Mom, he looks like me." Thank you for helping him believe that skin color doesn't define intelligence. Tasha R., Houston, Texas. Kofi didn't need a trophy because his victory wasn't measured in awards. It was measured in the belief he inspired. It was a quiet Monday morning. Gentle sunlight filtered through the dorm room window, casting a warm glow on a pale blue envelope on Kofi's desk. No return address. Just a simple line written on the front. To Kofi Ellis, the one who lit my dream. Kofi opened the letter. The handwriting was clumsy and childlike, but within it was something no words could truly replicate. Belief. My name is Jordan. I'm in 11th grade at a public school near Detroit. Back in 9th grade, my math teacher told me, people like you should go to trade school. Don't dream of college. I was going to give up on math. But when I saw you on TV, I cried. Because for the first time in my life, I saw someone like me. Same skin, same background, standing among geniuses and winning. Thank you for not giving up. Because of you, I tried again for my school's math team, and I made it. The letter ended with a single line, boldly underlined. Math doesn't have a color. Thank you for proving that. Meanwhile, in another corner of the University of Michigan, Professor Evelyn Harrow sat in quiet reflection in her office, a cup of tea, long gone cold, resting in her hand. On the desk before, she lay Kofi's academic file, which she had just requested to be reviewed, because she still couldn't believe what he had done. No scholarship, no private tutor, no privileges, only grades, all A's, and dozens of problem sets filled with original, independent proofs. She opened an older folder, flipping to Kofi's admissions interview notes. One sentence stood out in the evaluator's remarks. Applicant does not come from a prestigious school, but demonstrates extraordinary reasoning ability, recommending special admission. She remembered clearly how she had struck out that recommendation during the committee meeting, just because he was an unknown from a poor neighborhood. Outside, the chatter of students buzzed across the campus, but in that office, only the silence of a realization slowly formed. That night, Harrow sat alone. No papers, no textbooks, only a worn mirror on the wall in front of her. She looked into the face of the woman reflected, eyes firm from a lifetime in academia. But this time her gaze was no longer so sure. Could I have been wrong? Did I use strict standards to hide my fear, afraid that someone like him could surpass it all without needing my approval? The next morning, Harrow arrived at class earlier than usual. She didn't say anything to the students. She didn't mention the competition. But before the lecture began, she looked straight at Kofi and nodded. A nod. Not from a professor praising a student, but from a person beginning to let go of her prejudice. Kofi began receiving dozens more letters from students, parents, and teachers across America. Each letter was a small piece of the system that had once broken him, and was now, little by little, beginning to change. Late night. Professor Evelyn Harrow's office was as silent as a forgotten library. There is no sound of pages turning, no light from the formula projector. Only her, alone, surrounded by walls covered in plaques, conference photos, and the past. On the desk lay admissions files from years ago. She picked up the first one. Kofi Ellis. Application. 3 years ago. The memories came rushing back. Back then, when she read the file of a boy from a poor Detroit neighborhood with a brief letter of recommendation from a public school teacher, she had skimmed past it. Not because he wasn't brilliant, but because a student with no foundation, no system, can he survive in this environment? She once believed that was realism. Now she understood. It was a lack of faith. She turned her chair. On the bookshelf, a framed photo of her as a young graduate stood beside her mentor, Professor Jacob Monroe, a math genius who once told her, "Never judge talent by background. Genius can grow from any soil." She had forgotten those words until Kofi stood up and reminded her through action without needing anyone's permission. The next morning, Professor Harrow arrived at the lecture hall earlier than usual. No one knew she had stayed awake the whole night. She silently wrote the day's lesson on the board when students poured into class, just like always. But when she turned around, her gaze settled on the middle row, where Kofi sat quietly, humbly, as he did every class. She spoke, her voice low but clear. "I used to think that people like you, Kofi, wouldn't go far. But perhaps I'm the one who needs to relearn the most basic lesson. That talent has no shape, no color, and no zip code. It only needs a chance. The classroom fell still. A female student slowly nodded. A male student lowered his head, avoiding Kofi's gaze, as a silent apology for past ridicule. Kofi said nothing, but in his eyes, for the first time, there was forgiveness. That evening, an anonymous post began circulating on the university's student forum. Some professors never change, but today I saw one begin to. A third-year math student. In a world where prejudice often outlives compassion, Harrow's silence today was no longer cold. It was a reflection in silence, the kind only the truly brave are capable of. Summer. While top students were busy accepting scholarships and chasing PhDs at Stanford, MIT, or Harvard, Kofi Ellis was measuring, scrubbing, and repainting faded walls in a small abandoned house in his old Detroit neighborhood, the very place where he grew up. No reporters, no microphones, no spotlight, just a few neighborhood kids running around, curious. "Hey, Kofi, what is this place?" He smiled, wiped the sweat from his brow, and replied, "It's a classroom. Your classroom." After winning the national math competition, Kofi received many offers from prestigious research institutes, with benefits anyone would dream of. But he turned them all down. Why? "I can't live far from the place that once crushed my belief, and now desperately needs a spark of light." With the prize money from the competition and a follow-up sponsorship fund, Kofi founded a free learning space named Ellis Math Lab, where math begins with belief. The classroom had no luxurious desks or state-of-the-art tech, just a whiteboard, worn-out books, and kids who had once been labeled as not cut out for math. A shy 6th grade girl whispered, "I'm not good at this. My dad says girls shouldn't study math." Kofi knelt and looked her in the eyes. "They once told me, black boys shouldn't dream of stuff like this. But you see me now, don't you?" One day, a journalist from the Detroit Chronicle came to interview him. "Why didn't you choose the path of prestige and instead return here?" Kofi answered, "Because I know what it feels like to be underestimated, and I won't let anyone else feel that again." From then on, every evening, that little room lit up, no longer by the glow of a street lamp, like when Kofi studied in the cold, but by the light of opportunity being passed on. On the back wall of the classroom, he painted a quote in white. "Math has no skin color. It only needs courage." An autumn afternoon. Inside the tiny community classroom, sunlight streamed through dust-covered windows, casting warm light on worn-out notebooks. Kofi Ellis stood beside a whiteboard, explaining integrals with slow, careful strokes of chalk. In front of him were more than 20 small faces, mostly children of color, a few from immigrant families, and some who had once dropped out of school. But their eyes sparkled. Each letter, each formula on the board acted like a bridge, connecting where they stood to where they could reach. A skinny boy in the front row with sharp eyes raised his hand. "Kofi, were you ever scared? Are you scared of being wrong? Scared of failing?" The room fell silent. Kofi put the chalk down. He sat on the edge of the desk, his gaze distant for a moment, then smiled gently. "Of course, I was terrified, but I was even more afraid of never trying." Outside the classroom, a group of journalists watched through the window. A new article was being drafted. From streetlight to whiteboard, the black boy opening paths for the next generation. In that small room, Kofi needed no medals, no certificates, no accolades from elite institutions. Instead, he planted seeds of hope, each lesson a quiet declaration. Talent doesn't come with a skin color. A once shy girl now walked to the board with confidence to solve equations. A boy expelled for being incapable now helped his classmates understand integrals. And Kofi, the one who was once told, Math isn't for kids like you was creating a generation that would never hear those words again. The story ends with an image. A camera zooms out from above the classroom. Scrawled letters, uneven but determined, are painted on the wall behind Kofi. Math has no skin color. It only needs courage. The final sounds, chalk scribbling on the board, and the laughter of children. The future is being rewritten, one line at a time.